A young man accidentally dropped a piece of instant noodles into a sand table. The next moment, a thick piece of instant noodles, as large as a pillar, fell onto an ancient altar. The empress, who was conducting a ritual to the heavens, was very confused. She thought it was the result of her prayer to the heavens, but she didn't know that the food was just a piece of instant noodle debris dropped by the young man. The young man was originally a general in the ancient times. He was killed by spies from an enemy nation. By chance, he traveled through time and arrived in the modern world 2,000 years later. He had to learn to adapt to modern life, living in a cheap rental apartment and eating instant noodles every day. One day, an anonymous delivery arrived at his door. When he uncovered the cover, he found a sand table inside. He recognized that the sand table represented his ancient kingdom. With a magnifying glass, he could see everything happening in the country, including the empress bathing clearly. Since the empress ascended the throne, the entire country had been suffering from a famine. The marquis, who coveted the throne, took the opportunity to force the empress to abdicate. Even the empress dowager threatened her that if the people didn't have enough food after this ritual, she would have to abdicate voluntarily. The ministers discussed that if the general were still alive, he would never allow the empress to suffer from the pressure of corrupt officials. Watching the empress being humiliated from the modern world, the young man angrily squeezed the instant noodles in his hand, unintentionally dropping the residue into the sand table. It happened to fall in the center of the altar. Looking at the thick food falling from the sky, everyone exclaimed that it was a gift from the heavens. Seeing this, the empress was overjoyed, immediately boiling the noodle and sharing it with everyone to taste. The ministers all praised it. However, the marquis believed this was just a trick by the empress. At the same time, the young man, knowing that the empress was performing this ritual to resolve the famine, immediately poured an entire box of instant noodles into the sand table. The next moment, a large bag of instant noodles fell onto the altar, and the royal granary was already full. Upon hearing this good news, the empress was overjoyed, thinking that with these foods, the people would be able to survive the winter. But unexpectedly, the enemy army suddenly attacked. The empress personally led the troops on the city wall to command the battle, but the enemy had already cut off reinforcements and supplies. If they didn't retreat soon, they might die there. As a former general, the young man knew well that the enemy's weapons were advanced, so he immediately went out to purchase equipment to help the empress. Seeing that the enemy army was about to break into the city, he pulled out a flamethrower and aimed it at the enemy soldiers in the sand table. Soon, the enemy soldiers were too scared to continue attacking the city. Then he threw fireworks and firecrackers at the enemy army, and the battlefield instantly became chaotic. The enemy commander thought it was the empress using sorcery, and immediately ordered a retreat. Little did they know, it was all the young man helping from behind the scenes. The empress, learning that heavenly fire had repelled the enemy, speculated that it was the general's soul in the heavens helping them, so she led the ministers to honor the general's memory. She had just placed the general's battle uniform onto the altar, when the young man suddenly sneezed, and a gust of wind blew his helmet into the copper cauldron. The helmet was instantly transported to his rental apartment 2,000 years later. Looking at the helmet, the young man remembered the scenes of him fighting in battle, so he put on the helmet that rightfully belonged to him again. On the other side, the empress noticed the helmet had disappeared, and believed that the general's spirit had accepted the offerings. She immediately placed gold, silver, jewelry, and other treasures into the copper cauldron. Soon, all these items were transported to the young man's home. Suddenly, the enemy army attacked again, and assassins had infiltrated the city, planning to assassinate the empress. The young man was very worried when he discovered this, and picked up a wooden stick, a kitchen knife, and a chainsaw to help. But these items were too powerful, and could hurt the empress and the people in the sand table. Seeing the empress in danger, the young man was so anxious he didn't know what to do. In a moment of panic, he stepped on the wooden stick on the floor and fell into the sand table. The empress looked up, and saw that her most trusted general had returned. However, as the clouds dispersed, the general disappeared again. When he was bounced back, he realized that the sand table could only teleport objects, not people. He had no choice but to secretly protect the empress. Because the assassination attempt on the empress failed, the enemy commander believed the general was protecting her from above, so he ordered a sorcerer to cast a spell to destroy the general's soul. Seeing this, the young man poured instant noodles into the sand table. The sorcerer, in the midst of casting the spell, was instantly scalded to death. Upon witnessing this, the enemy commander ordered the army to retreat. The empress was overjoyed upon hearing this news, suspecting that the general was protecting her from the heavens. Unbeknownst to her, the young man was outside with a magnifying glass, spying on her while she was bathing. When she finished dressing and came out, the marquis's son had already surrounded the entire city with his soldiers, intending to force the empress to abdicate. The young man, seeing the empress in danger through the sand table, immediately threw out a loudspeaker, and warned them to lay down their weapons and surrender, or they would be struck by lightning. The soldiers, believing the general had become a deity after his death, had witnessed his powers the day before, but the marquis's son didn't believe it, thinking it was just a trick by the empress. The next second, he was electrocuted to death by the young man. At this moment, the empress was certain that the general had always been watching over them. She then returned to the palace with her subordinates to deal with the rebellious marquis. The young man also decided to continue helping the empress. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door of his rented room. He hurriedly covered the sand table with cloth. When he opened the door, he found the landlady standing outside, because the young man was always mysterious in the house, living on instant noodles, but somehow somehow able to pay the rent with a gold bar. The landlady suspected that he had a treasure chest hidden in his room, so she wore a sexy nightgown to try and seduce him. As a righteous ancient general, the young man wasn't tempted, and he immediately closed the door to spy on what treasures were inside. The landlady decided to play cosplay the next night, dressing in the empress's attire, striking seductive poses to try and lure the young man. The young man would never allow anyone to disrespect the empress, so he immediately chased after the landlady, demanding she take off the clothes. Little did he know, he had fallen into her trap, as the landlady had already arranged for her brother to hide in the shadows. After the young man left, her brother sneaked into the room and uncovered the cloth covering the sand table.